This presentation is part of a series on the Eucharist. And in this session, I'd like to speak a little bit about 1 Corinthians. Now, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians was written sometime around 55 AD. So it's about 20 years before the Gospels were written. And his account of the institution of the Eucharist is therefore the oldest written version that we have. But already in this oldest version, Paul recognizes that there's two dimensions of the Eucharist. The first dimension is the vertical dimension, that this is the real presence of Jesus. He says to the community that when they receive the bread and the wine, they're receiving the body and blood of Christ. Now, the reason he says this is part of the difficulty in this community. In this community, we have people who think that they can go to prostitutes and sleep with them and still call oneself a Christian. You see, Corinth was a port city, and in fact, it had two ports. And there were a lot of prostitutes who would service the sailors when they came into town. And some of the Christians fell into this vice. So he said, how can you say that you are uniting yourself to Christ and then you unite yourself to the body of that woman? It doesn't make sense. It's one or the other. And furthermore, he has to deal with the question of eating meat offered to idols. That if we're eating the body of Christ, we can't eat sacrifices offered to idols. You see, meat was very rare in those days. And you tended to eat meat that was bought at a butcher shop right next door to the pagan temple. The pagans would offer a cow to Zeus. They would give some small parts of that animal to the pagan god, and then the rest would be butchered and sold. So some of the people in the community say, can we eat that meat? Paul is very clear. You can't eat it if you believe that that God is real, because you've united yourself to Christ. But what about the fact that this God doesn't exist? We Christians know that the pagan gods are a fantasy. There's nothing there. Well, Paul says that's all fine and true. But what about the bad example you'll give to grandma? That she would see you eating that meat and think that you're worshiping a pagan god. So notice, in this case, Eucharist enters into the horizontal dimension. That because I've eaten the body and blood of Christ, I should give good example to others, that I shouldn't scandalize them. Now, the other section that talks about the Eucharist is when Paul actually talks about the Eucharistic meal they're celebrating. And when I say Eucharistic meal, I mean a meal. This is a very early time in the history of the church. And when the people gather together, they read some of the readings from the Old Testament, and then they have a full meal. The difficulty is, some people come with lobster bisque and crab imperial, with prime rib, and then other people don't even have enough to eat. And instead of sharing their food, each person eats what he has. And in that, Paul says they're sinning against communion, the horizontal dimension of Eucharist, that we are supposed to share everything we have. In fact, one of the fathers of the church, Tertullian, says that which is in excess is robbed from the poor. God has blessed us with many things, not so that we can enjoy them ourselves, but so that we can share them with those who don't have. And that's especially true at the Eucharist. At the Eucharist, if Jesus is giving himself to us in such a gracious fashion, we should be willing to give ourselves to others in that same way. So notice this letter, written 2 decades before the Gospels, already has the vertical and the horizontal dimension of Eucharist, that this is truly the presence of Jesus, but this is truly a call to service of our brothers and sisters.